see how it works. All right. So this week we're going to talk about periodization. Periodization is kind of the next step. We talked about program design, all of the small stuff, all of the details. This is the big picture that creates those long-term adaptations. Okay, so periodization is the planned variation of modifiable variables, all of our COFA that we went over the last couple weeks, to achieve a specific adaptation at a specific time. This is the key point. We are planning variation. Talked about variation is not random, it is planned. We plan everything to achieve specific adaptations at specific times. It doesn't matter if you're not strong at the competition. If you get really strong and then it goes away, there's a problem. If you get really fast and it goes away before you need it, there's a problem. Okay? We need to plan and set those variations so that we achieve the best possible adaptation at the best possible time. Okay. So, some things to think about first. Beginners adapt to absolutely everything, so your periodization model for beginners can be very loose and fluid. Whatever you do, they're going to get better because they've never done anything. It's after that 10 to 12 weeks where they get past that plateau, after the first couple years realistically of training, that's when we need to really go into our periodization, really go into our long-term planning. Okay? But in the end, if we're going for long-term planning, thinking year, 2 years, 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, 20 years in the future, it's all about progressive overload and cyclical timing of adaptations. We can't get better at everything at the same time. We have to get better at some things to allow us to improve at others, and then we have to come back to those others so that we can progress in what we really want. So it's a cyclical over and over trying to build, regress, build, regress, build, regress, build, regress. Yeah. How it all started, kind of our story of Milo. We talked a little bit when we talked progressive overload, the story of Milo. Milo had a bull, loved his bull, but his bull couldn't walk, so every day he would pick up his bull, carry it to go get water, carry it back, and as the bull got bigger, he got bigger, and it went on and on and on and on until he could carry a full-grown bull. He didn't keep getting bigger bulls though. Okay? It's progressive overload, but that progressive overload, that linear progression only lasts so long. He can't carry two bulls, and if we keep going for longer and longer, this is up until, we'll say, a trained or intermediate to advanced athlete. So we've linearly progressed, and now it's time that we have to vary something a little bit because we can't keep adding more weight. We can't keep adding more velocity. There's a limit to what we can do. I'm going to send you the article. It'll be a part of some of your lab presentations or your lab projects, reading through that article and giving your interpretation. Okay. How we started really thinking about periodization were the Russians. The Russians kind of gave us that big start. Most of the literature in strength and conditioning is Russian because the US decided that everything was cardiovascular exercise after about 1900. And the Soviets said, let's get stronger, and that's why they beat us in a lot of Olympics. Because they got very strong, and for strength sports, strength is kind of what you need. I have a link in here. You can go to Verkhoshansky's articles. He's kind of one of our foundational Soviets when it comes to periodization, long-term planning, and they have a lot of research. They have a lot of research when it comes to periodization, long-term planning, because they had their athletes from when they were 12 until they were 25 competing. So we have some good data on long-term planning. A lot of it is still in Russian, but there's a lot of translated stuff. If you're interested in some of that, I can send you links to books and other things of that sort. Okay. If we look at Bulgarians were also very successful, especially in the 80s in weightlifting. They have a different style of periodization. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is all found, their head coach was Ivan Abajev. He came to the US after he had to leave Bulgaria. But they have a different structure. Theirs is very linear periodization to an extent, kind of maxing, building, but in very few exercises, very specific training, rather than very general training that we see with more Soviets. It's general, diverse, they have multiple exercises. Bulgarians stick to a few and got very good at very specific training. Their SED principle is kind of the foundation for what they do. Okay? So different types of periodization. Linear, not really periodization because it's not variation. It's linear, so it's not technically periodization, but you'll see it as linear periodization. This is kind of straight line progressive overload. We have undulating periodization where we flow up with volume, flow back down, Same with intensity and mix and match the two. Conjugate system we'll talk about a little bit. This is planned variation of exercise choice to continually progress and avoid accommodation with exercises. Okay, we have concurrent models. Concurrent models are what we use most often in sport, where we're trying to achieve multiple adaptations at the same time. Most field court sports are not based on one specific attribute. You have to be strong, you have to be fast, you have to have endurance, and a mix and match of the two. You can't get everything all at the same time, but we can mix and match and get the best of all those worlds to an extent. Okay, we have our Bulgarian, very specific training, and then the more traditional kind of US model of hypertrophy, doing bodybuilding split routines. These are all different types of periodization, but they all kind of have that foundation in a more linear undulating model. Okay, so if we think about linear periodization or linear structure, this is a progressive overload. Think of this as constant progressive overload. Every week you add 5 more pounds. Every week you add 10 more pounds. Every week you add another rep. Think about this as constant progression. This works for beginners to an extent. You can continue every time. You can make it a little bit more complex. You can make it a little bit heavier, a little bit faster, but it will stop. This linear periodization doesn't go on forever. It's a great structure when you're starting. So if you went right now with some client, some athlete, first 12 weeks, you could probably add 5 pounds every single day. They may need to recover a little bit, but you could probably add it as you go. This doesn't work in the long term. Does not work in the long term. With undulating periodization, we mix and match volume and intensity. We know that those are inversely related. So maybe one week we go high volume, low intensity, something middle, something high intensity, low volume, and you undulate through them. Okay, that allows recovery from volume, recovery from intensity, and allows us to continually progress over time. This also works to an extent. This is undulating volume and intensity. We also need to undulate exercise choice, movement patterns, because if we use, say we use the bench press and all we did was the bench press for 365 days or a full training cycle and only train the bench press every single week, we would see diminishing returns. So undulating exercise choice, undulating movement pattern with volume intensity is a better structure. That's where we come in with more of a conjugate system. The conjugate method is kind of coined by Westside. If you're into powerlifting, you've seen Westside stuff, Louis Simmons. If you're interested in that, I can send you information on his stuff. Most of his is focused around powerlifting itself, so squat, bench, deadlift, squat, bench, deadlift, squat, bench, deadlift. He does train some other athletes for other sports, but they use a system of varying exercise choice based around those 3 lifts and a wave undulating model with volume and intensity. So they use this undulating format in 3-week intervals with varying exercises and moving up to a maximum in every week with a different exercise in their specific zone. So everything is very structured, but it is very different every single time they train. They also mix and match and undulate within the week. So they will have a maximum effort day and a dynamic effort day. So maximum effort day, they're looking to maximize load within that rep or within that rep scheme, within that exercise, and 72 hours later, because that allows central nervous system regeneration, adaptation, a high velocity dynamic day 3 days later, and the same for both upper and lower lifts. This is the conjugate system. This is their system. It works to an extent with it trained powerlifters. Okay, this is for trained athlete, it's not for your beginning athlete. So we do need to start with more of a linear model, move to a more undulating model, moving to possibly a conjugate system or a concurrent training model. And we can use a concurrent model where we use strength training, we use endurance training, we use high velocity training. This is what you'll see in most team sport settings. So they may do their conditioning, they may do their speed work or the change of direction work, and they may do strength training. We're trying to build strength, to build power with endurance for most sports. In this model, you will not get as fast as possible, as you possibly could. You will not have the best endurance possible. You won't have the most strength possible, but you'll have some of each. It's not about maximizing all of them. It's about improving each one and playing the sport well. That's the key here, is we're trying to build capacity in all of these so that they can play better in their sport. Most athletes are not strength athletes. If they're strength athletes, they're not doing a lot of this high velocity work. They're not doing a lot of conditioning work in that sense. But if they're doing some more conditioning based or endurance activities, maybe they need to be a little bit stronger, a little bit faster, very conditioned. We stick to what's most useful and then try to develop other qualities to improve the quality that matters most, which in most cases is sport-specific skill and power or strength endurance. Most sports require endurance with power, with speed. So we have to use some kind of concurrent training model. If we're looking at elite weightlifting, we can use the Bulgarian system. They work up to a daily training max in the snatch, the clean and jerk, and the front squat. But their training is mixed up throughout the day, so they may have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 training sessions per day where they build up to a max snatch and then they go rest. And then they come back, build up to a max clean and jerk, rest. So smaller increments, higher intensities, continual higher intensities, the most specific training model we have. It works best when you're on drugs, because you can recover from all of that. Some people now are trying to do this for themselves. They're not trained enough to do this. You probably should be training in a linear to undulating to conjugate model to get into this, to be trained enough for this to matter. Because when you get very good at squat, snatch, clean and jerk, you don't get very good at any other quality. Okay? It's very specific to the training you want. It worked really well for them, but they're also looking for the best of the best within their country and training them from the time they're very young. So it's not something to jump into randomly. If you're not on drugs, you probably can't do this every single day of the week. There's some models that are now a weekly Bulgarian system where it's one day you build up to max snatch and then a couple days later, max clean and jerk, a couple days later, max squat. More realistic for kind of today's times or for the general athlete. But very specific to those movements, you're not going to build much endurance. You're going to build a lot of strength in those lifts, and that's about it. Okay? What we see most today is a bodybuilding split routine from most general athletes will walk into your gym and say, so we're doing upper and lower, we're doing back and bis, chest and tris, legs, push, pull. And these are split-based routines. Most of them come from what you saw in magazines, looking at what Arnold did, or they did push-pull, or they did back and bis, chest and tris, legs, and split those out. This works well for bodybuilding, works well for hypertrophy, but hypertrophy is not always what we want with our athletes. Our athletes don't need to be the biggest. They don't need to have the most defined muscles. They need to be able to play their sport. Okay? When we're trying to play our sport, we don't need to look like Arnold. We need to look well enough to play our sport. We need to be skilled enough, fast enough, strong enough, conditioned enough to play the sport, not to go on stage and look a certain way. If you're working with bodybuilders, it will work as long as you undulate volume and intensity, vary exercise choice, progressively to reach that goal. Okay? So now what about team sports? What about the stuff we care about? We're working with team sport athletes in most cases. What you'll see most often or used most often is a traditional block periodization. Block periodization comes from the Russians. Now we've kind of progressed it into our standard model of somewhat linear, somewhat undulating periodization. It's kind of a mix of all of them. Okay. So think linear adaptations, we're trying to build those adaptations up to a point, and we're undulating volume and intensity. Most often you'll see the 4-week block, or a 4-week mesocycle that is smaller volume, more volume, most volume, or smaller intensity, medium intensity, most intensity, and then a recovery week, and then we build back up. We build back up, and we build back up. This works very well because we have a certain amount of weeks in the year, and most months cycle around a 4-week cycle, and this works very well for recovery-based building. It's fun. Okay, this is kind of what we'll see as a standard block. What do you think are some pros and cons of this structure? We can gain a lot of one adaptation in this, but think about all of those adaptations we need. It's harder to, if we're always progressing to 1 week, what about our competitions?
They're only so long.
They're only so long, but what if we're doing our highest fatigue day on a competition week? Are you going to get that high fatigue day? No, you're going to have to pick it on another day, but you may have residual fatigue. Planning this in season gets difficult. But it doesn't have to look perfectly like this all the time. This is great for off-season based training. Great for off-season, pre-season, so that we can progress different adaptations, and then we go into more of a maintenance style periodization to continue to hold on to adaptations. So it won't look like this always. You can mix and match this. You can put it into 3 weeks where we just cut out this deload and we just go up and up and up, and very different adaptations, very different exercise choices, and progress in the long term. You can mix and match it where it's just 2. Maybe you have a heavy competition this week and you just build up and then you say compete. You can mix and match this structure. It doesn't have to be perfect every single time, but it's a great place to start with developing adaptations because it takes about 3 weeks to really progress within that exercise choice to get you to where you need to be and perform, and then you do need to recover. One of the other issues is that if we put that to the next week, it's almost like we have 2 recovery weeks next to each other. So you may want to mix and match your performance week or your heavy week after a deload. They maybe go up, up, down, up, or wave it in that sense. But this is a great place to start with your structure. If you look at most certification exams, this is the structure: is block, up, 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 down, up, 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 down. It works. You can also mix and match it where everything is as hard as it can and goes down, and then up and down. Depends on what you need, depends on the needs of your sport, the needs of your athlete, and how you're trying to progress those adaptations. Okay. So, if we think about within a whole season or a whole year, from day 1 to day 365, we want to build up performance ability to their in-season where they can realize it, they can maintain it, and then post-season they do have to recover. You can't be your best every single day, and your athletes need to know that. Okay? They may want to max out every single day or be the strongest every day. That's not the goal. If you try to be your best every day, you're going to fall off. And you're probably going to be your best not when you need it. This structure is easy for high competition sports where they have 1 day or 1 week where they have to be very, very good. Think track, swimming, weightlifting, strength sports, speed sports, where you have a meet and everything has to be great at one time. You can progress and plan around that day. Makes it a lot easier. Most team sports, you have to be good for about 3 months. So maintenance is difficult. This is where structure and re-establishing stimulus gets difficult. So our basic structure, the basic structure of your plan, your project, should look like this in your periodization structure. So you should have an off season where you're trying to build up. This is where we're developing adaptations, developing skill, developing hypertrophy, developing conditioning, and getting the athlete ready to be more specific. Pre-season, you're trying to build specific adaptations for that season. So this is where you get really strong really fast, building conditioning and hypertrophy, building speed and strength and power, maintaining and realizing those adaptations, because if you fatigue masks adaptations. So here we're trying to really cause fatigue, cause adaptation, and making sure that adaptation is realized in season. So they may start decreasing their performance in this preseason area. That's okay, and they need to know that that's okay. You should be tired, you should be fatigued, because now we're going to recover and realize those adaptations. They should feel terrible in preseason. They should not feel like they are at their best in preseason, because if they feel like they're at their best in preseason, they're only going to get worse. If they feel bad, and we start to begin to taper off and lower volume, decrease what we're doing on our side and increasing what they're doing on the sports side, they will realize that strength, power, speed adaptation and be able to use it in competition, because that's all that really matters. I don't care how strong an athlete is in the off season. I don't care how fast they are in the preseason. I care how they can perform in their sport in the season. That's all that matters. And then after postseason, okay, in season goes to competition. Postseason for me is after they're done with their sport. So all competitions are over. Their in season should end with their highest competition, championships, NCAAs, Super Bowl, whatever you're planning them for, high school, league, CIF, wherever you're going. That should be the end of your in-season plan where you want them to be the best. After that, allow them to recover. They need to be able to recover and come back to build in the off-season. And hopefully we can start this build from a higher standpoint than they were before. That's that long-term planning. So if we can keep building, then maybe our next periodization starts here, the next starts here, their fourth year they're with you, their senior year they're here, and then they're going all the way up and they're excelling. They're not going to be the best in their first year. We want to build them so they're at their best in their third and fourth year, especially if it's at the high school or college level, because that's when you get the scholarship, that's when you have the chance to go to a professional level, and then you're just trying to be the best as long as you can. Okay. So let's break this down a little bit. How we break down this cycle in the start is the macro cycle. Think about this as your whole year or your whole entire plan, the annual cycle, everything that you're doing is your macro cycle, your full training cycle, everything from the day you start to the day it's over. Okay. Each block, it's block periodization, each of these blocks, think of these as specific adaptations you're trying to achieve within a time frame. So think of these blocks as off-season, pre-season, in-season, and post-season. So I would have 4 blocks within my training cycle. Okay, that's our cycle for each has a purpose, each I have something I want within those. The next is a mesocycle. This is within each block. Okay, so a specific piece of that adaptation that I want to develop that will build onto the next mesocycle or build towards that goal I'm trying to achieve. So maybe I have 1 mesocycle for a block, maybe I have 2, maybe I have 3, maybe I have 4, but a mesocycle is kind of like a group of weeks focused around building one adaptation. Your structure dictates how long your mesocycles are. They could be 1 week, they could be 4 weeks, they could be 3 weeks, they could be 8 weeks. Depends on your structure and what you need to achieve. Okay. The microcycle is kind of, think of this as our small, our 1 week or 2 weeks, 10 days, whatever your structure is. This is our piece of the mesocycle. It's a piece. Think about it as one cycle of exercise choice. So often it will be 1 week for each microcycle, 1 to 2 weeks where you will do 1 set of exercises Monday, 1 set of exercises Wednesday, 1 Friday. And then you'll repeat that microcycle or you'll move on to a new microcycle. But it's a set of groupings of exercises. Okay, think about it as our choice planning. This is where we actually get to plug in more exercises. Our microcycle should fit with our mesocycle, should fit with our block, should fit with our macrocycle as a piece. We're building up structure. Okay? The microcycle, if your microcycle doesn't fit for the goal of the mesocycle, you've developed your microcycle incorrectly. This is where we plan all of those modifiable variables, and then we put together sessions, or each training session, into our microcycles. So a microcycle is a group of sessions, a mesocycle is a group of microcycles, a block is a group of mesocycles, and a macrocycle is a group of blocks. So we build it up like a pyramid. We have all of our individual sessions that fit into our week or 2 week microcycle, which fit into our 2, 3, 4, 8 week mesocycle, into our 4, 8, 12, 20 week block, into our 12-month macrocycle or 4-year macrocycle or 6-month macrocycle, depending on our season, depending on our sport, depending on the athletes you're working with. We start creating our plan from the big picture first. We do not start by creating one exercise session. The session should be the last thing we do. We need to start with our macrocycle and re-engineer, think back from the end, backtrack to the beginning. So if our goal is to compete at competition X, that's the end of our macrocycle, and we backtrack our way. What do we want to achieve in post-season, or in the end of season, competition season? What do we want to achieve in season? What do we want to achieve pre-season, off-season, and post-season? how can all of that build up to the competition? Start from the end and backtrack it all the way down. And then you can start creating blocks that will help you structure within your calendar, mesocycles that will help you structure those adaptations, microcycles to structure within that mesocycle so you hit that point, and then you develop the session that allows that to happen. So start at the end. If someone says, oh, I want you to plan a program, or your head coach says, okay, we're going to structure a program, and they start with, what are we going to do today? You're starting at the wrong point. It's like starting in the middle of the race, okay? And then you're turned all around, okay? Start at the end and backtrack your way. Okay? Always start at the end goal, because everything must align to that end goal in a cyclical, periodized manner, okay? So our goal of the macrocycle, say it's one season, maybe it's a 6-month season, maybe it's a year, maybe it's an Olympic quadrennial, it's 4 years. This is the goal. Our goal is to win. Okay? If your goal isn't to win, you're not planning well. Okay? You should be wanting to win. Your athletes want to win, you should want to win, your coach wants to win. Okay? So plan where your achievement is for this cycle. Maybe it's CIF championships, maybe it's the league championships, maybe it's just the end of the season because you know your team's not good enough to go to postseason, so you plan to the end of the season. Maybe it's even longer, it's 4 years, you're like, okay, we're going to finish here, the next year we're going to finish here, the next year we're going to finish here. You're planning from your end at the start. This is where you want to go. If you're not planning from that, you're planning to not succeed to the point where you need to be. Okay? So now we've decided our goal. Our goal is to win at the end of the season. Now we need to find when to train. So I'll look at my calendar. Say, here's my calendar from 2018. All right. What should I do first? Start from the end, all right? First I need to find out when the holidays are, because I can't train on those days. I also need to plan the vacations, because I'm a college coach. I need to find out when they're not going to be with me. I can't even plan to the end, because I don't even know which days are available. Now I'll know when finals are, okay, because we can't train during finals, because NCAA says that you can't train. Now I need to find the games. Okay, when are the games? I know I can't train on game day in most cases. And where's the postseason, or where's the end of the season? So now I know my end. Now what do I do? Does this look like I can train a whole lot? It looks like I can train in October and September, which are not going to be anywhere near June. Looks like all of these games are going to dictate when I can play. Looks like I can train a little bit in February. They can train on their own in January. I can't see them in postseason. This is a lot to deal with, right? Does this stress you out a little bit, just looking at all of the stuff that you have to worry about? And you haven't even built in your blocks for anything, any of your goals? This is where you have to start. Yeah, you have to start here. Now I know which days are available, how I can structure my plan. I know that I can't have a 4-day microcycle here because I'm playing 3 to 4 days a week. If this is college baseball, they play on Tuesday or Wednesday, and then they play 3 days on the weekend. It's 4 days a week. I can only train maybe 1, 2, 3 for my position players, so I need to know that ahead of time. If I'm going to backtrack, I know that I have to have small microcycles. I know that I can get a pretty good preseason, but I know that I'm going to come from an off season where they can't see me for a little bit because they're on vacation. So hopefully they do well on their own, and I may need to have to rebuild a little bit in this. I know that I have a good amount of time with them here, but they're going to go on vacation, so I can build it, and then they're just going to fall off. I need a lot of structure here. It's messy. It's not going to be perfect. Nothing is perfect. It's the best case scenario. So you need to work with what you can do. If this is a high school season, you can just cut all of this out because they're playing another sport, or they can't work with you because CIF says that you can only work with a certain amount. Then maybe it's nothing here, it's all up there. You're like, oh crap, I only can train them for like 4 weeks. This is a mess. It's all a mess. So deal with it. A plan around it. Look at it at the start so that it doesn't surprise you at the end. Okay? So now I'm going to plan my nice pretty macro cycle. I'm going to pick 4 blocks because I talked about it earlier that I'm going to have off-season, preseason, in-season, postseason. So I'll plan my blocks around the time of the year. Let's say my competition is here in November, December. I'm going to plan for a December competition. Okay, just keep it nice and easy structure. So block 1, I'm going to build hypertrophy because I know that hypertrophy helps with strength, right? More muscle mass, I have more capability to be stronger. Okay? Now I'm going to get stronger because I've gained all this hypertrophy. Now I'm going to build strength. What's next? Is strength all I need for sport? No, what do I need for sport? Speed, I need power, okay? Next I'll go to power because strength contributes to power more than it contributes to speed. So now I'll get bigger, stronger, and then faster with that strength, and then I'll get as fast as possible because power can help me develop speed. Think of this as kind of our linear structure. This is very, very foundational. It's not going to be perfect like this every time, because what happens to my hypertrophy by block 4? It's gone. It's going to go away. What about my strength by block 4? Some of it's going to go away. Okay? My power by block 4? Some of it's going to go away. But I know speed goes away the fastest. Okay? The residual effect of speed is very, very short. Okay? It's only 1 to 2 weeks. You have to keep stimulating speed in order to maintain speed. Because it's the hardest to maintain, I'm going to put it in season. It's also less fatiguing, so I can have it in season. Okay, if I got really fast here in block 1, I'm like, okay, I'm working with my sprinters. We're going to get really fast in the off season, so that we'll be really fast in season. What's going to happen? Speed's going to diminish because they're going to peak before they need to. Because speed can only stay around for so long. So I'll build hypertrophy, strength, power, speed. This is a general structure of our general outline if I need to be fast at the end of the season. I want my strength. Strength stays with you as long as you stimulate it about every 2 weeks. It'll maintain about 80% of your strength. So we can keep stimulating strength, but because it is fatiguing, we want to minimize how much we're doing in season when it comes to maximal strength work. Okay, power, a little bit less fatigue. We can do it a little closer to season. So let's kind of break down that block. I know I'm going to hypertrophy, so what, 3 sets of 10 for everything? Maybe, I don't know. And I need to be a little bit more specific. I need to go in a little bit further. Okay, I have 4 months. Can I maximize hypertrophy in month 1? No. Can I maximize it in month 3? Probably. It's going to take me some time to develop it, and that's when I'm going to be able to maximize it. So let's look at that maximizing my hypertrophy mesocycle. What do I know about this mesocycle? What's going to happen after it? Always looking backwards. Okay? I'm going to develop strength afterwards, right? So I need to prepare myself to be able to develop strength also. I can maximize hypertrophy, but I also need to work on that transition. If you have your athletes go from 3 sets of 12 to the next week 5 sets of 2, are they going to be able to maximize those 5 sets of 2? Absolutely not. They're deconditioned for that stimulus. So I'll start with my hypertrophy block. I'm going to start with hypertrophy and more muscular endurance based because I don't know how strong they are right now. These are my new athletes. I need to develop a little bit of conditioning, a little bit of work capacity with my hypertrophy. So I'm starting with what is kind of easier to do first, easier to develop, and it's going to build on the next step. If I just hop them into heavy, intense hypertrophy work, what's going to happen? They're going to need to recover at least some point. If I develop some endurance first, I can train them harder. I'm always trying to build them capable to do more so that I can realize it later. So next, now that they have a little bit more work capacity, I've given them a little taste of hypertrophy training. Now I can maximize it a little bit more. They've built that work capacity. This is going to build some more work capacity. And now I'm going to work into what's called functional hypertrophy, which is where I get stronger with hypertrophy. So this is high intensity. Think about that 6 to 8 rep range. Okay, we're in that 80 to 70% range. We're trying to build hypertrophy, but also get a little stronger at the same time. Okay, so it's going to be heavy, it's going to be fatiguing, it's going to challenge them. Okay, is this going to maximize hypertrophy in general? Are they going to be the biggest athletes ever? Probably not. But they'll be bigger than they were in Mesocycle 1. They've built some more work capacity, which is key. More capacity for strength. Now I stimulate them with some higher intensity work. I can move on to my strength cycle knowing that they are capable of training hard there. Because if they're not capable of doing strength work, they're not going to be able to get as strong as they could if we develop the capacity first. Okay, so we need to develop that capacity. So now I'm going to go down to my microcycle. I'm going to look at March. This is my functional hypertrophy where it's going to be heavy, it's going to be hard. Okay? Functional hypertrophy is the goal. So my mesocycle or my microcycle needs to correspond with the goal of the macrocycle. So that means I need to be training within that functional hypertrophy zone. If I say, oh, I'm going to do a functional hypertrophy microcycle and it looks like 3 sets of 12, do you think I'm working in the functional hypertrophy zone? If it looks like 5 sets of 2, does that look like functional hypertrophy? No, that looks like strength. I need it to be in that mid-range somewhere like 5 sets of 5 or 4 sets of 8, where it's going to be challenged them enough metabolically and tension-wise to get some hypertrophy, but it's also going to be strenuous enough to build strength. So I'm working on both together. So I'm going to look at my microcycle as 1 week, the 25th to the 31st. What do I do now?
After that.
What should I do now? I know that I'm going to do it this week. What should I do now? Do I start picking exercises? No, what do I have to do? What's next? Should I figure out when I'm going to train on that week? So I need to know when their practices are. I need to go back to the calendar and find out which days I can train. This is in my off season, so I know that I'm going to have a little bit more time to train. Maybe I'll know session 1, 2, and 3. So I'll go Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Those are the days I get to see my athletes. It's off season, I get them a little bit longer. Now I have my 3 sessions. Now what do I do? And now I can start kind of picking exercise. I can build that session that corresponds with the microcycle, the mesocycle, and the macrocycle. So, session 1, I'm planning lower extremity strength, squat with the goal of functional hypertrophy. I'm not even going to look at sets and reps yet. I'm going to say, okay, it's going to be squat exercise for this microcycle, and it's going to be functional hypertrophy as the goal. Session 2, bench press, functional hypertrophy. Okay, session 3, deadlift, functional hypertrophy. I'm just going to use the big 3 exercises. They're easy to think about and talk about. Okay, for building both functional hypertrophy, building strength. Okay. Now I know that I'm going lower extremity squat strength for functional hypertrophy, bench press for functional hypertrophy, deadlift for functional hypertrophy. Which microcycle is this? 1, 2, or 3, or 4? Which one was it? Backtrack yourselves.
1.
It's 4. It's microcycle 4. So if I'm going on a 4-week block, and I know that week 4, I'm going to need a down week or an up week. It's going to be my down week. So, what am I going to do? My intensity is going to be down. That gives me my intensity because I know it's a week 4 microcycle in functional hypertrophy. My rep range is going to be for functional hypertrophy, but my intensity is going to be down because it's a recovery week. I can maximize maybe some velocity here because it's a little bit lighter. I can still stimulate them, but this is a little bit easier for my training. If I looked at session 1 or microcycle 1, maybe it looks the same, but it's heavier. Maybe it's the same, but 70%. If it's macrocycle or microcycle 3, this is my loading week, my heavy week. Maybe it's the same rep range, but it's RM based. It's as much as you could do. Maybe it's at 80%. 75%, whatever the maximum you can do for that rep range. Because I'm trying to get them to overreach at that point, to go as far as they can. But this is my session, it's nice and easy, and maybe I'm doing some functional hypertrophy, general strength endurance after that, something that's lighter, easier for them to recover from. Does that make sense? This is just an example. So, let's break it all down together, how we break down this whole cycle, go through it again. So, we have our block 1, our mesocycle 3, microcycle 4, session 2. This gives me a structure if I was to tell my other coach that I'm doing a off-season block, functional hypertrophy mesocycle, session 2, they know what the rep range has to be. They know that if it's week 4 or microcycle 4, that it's going to be a recovery microcycle, so that's how we're going to load them. Does that make sense? Okay, so this gives a structure towards your plan all the way down to the smallest increment, which is 1 repetition or 1 exercise. If we build it back up, we can see the big picture of where we're going to go. Our athlete's going to think in microcycles. Your athletes think in microcycles. They don't think longer than a week. As the coach, you need to be able to think towards the end and know what the goal is so that you can convey and coach the athlete to achieve the goal within that session. Because say it's a bench press recovery functional hypertrophy session, are you going to let them go extra heavy if they feel good? No. They were doing that last week. Okay, so they may feel really good because it's a recovery week. If they overreach on their recovery week, what's going to happen to their next mesocycle? They're going to go down. That's not when we want them to go down. Okay, we want them to go down this week so that they feel better to build the next week. If you don't have this overarching plan, they may overreach at the wrong time. They overreach at the wrong time, we don't gain performance at the right time. So you maybe need to hold them back, you maybe need to let them go at sometimes, but only if it plans and fits with your long-term goal. Because they may feel really good on this recovery day. Anybody ever done a recovery week? How do you feel really good on Friday? And you want to just go for it? And then the next week you feel trashed because you overwent. Okay? Recovery week means recovery week. Maybe you say, okay, let's work on technique. Let's work on moving it well. Let's work on owning this weight. Maybe it's just telling them this is recovery week. You can't push it. You shouldn't push it. Or you just program exercises that don't allow them to push it. They plan it as a special variation, so then they have to regress so that they can't overreach. It's all about planning long-term so that we can achieve what we want to achieve. So this is what it would look like in a long-term plan if we looked at our volume, intensity, and our ability or our skill. Technique is our skill, intensity is our loading, and volume is how many repetitions, the total volume. A total volume will go down into season. Intensity will ramp up and then come down to in season, something that we can manage. Technique and skill is going to be worst in off season or post season and should be the best when it has to be. Okay, it has to be the best. Say this is our competition phase. We want competitive skill of that sport to be as best as possible as long as we can. Intensity can ramp up, but what does intensity do to our body? Causes fatigue. Does fatigue improve skill and performance? No, it masks it. So we need to really monitor that intensity and make sure that they're still getting stimulated to maintain the adaptation, but just enough minimal available dosage that we can give so that they can stay where they are as long as possible. So maybe that's every 2 weeks you say, hey, let's push it this week. You don't have a meet, you don't have a competition this day. Maybe it's on Monday because their competition is on Saturday. You say, okay, Monday, let's push it a little harder this week. And then you back off the next week, push it back off, or maybe you're just doing base and load or block 1, block 2 for the rest of your in-season phase. Okay? And then after that, we need to recover and then hopefully can rebuild that after. So if we look at how we can create that undulation, calculate or plan our volume and intensity. If we look at our block 1, if it's hypertrophy, intensity is going to be moderate to high. Volume is going to be very high. Think back to here. Intensity, moderate, volume, high, and it goes down. We need to plan that, and it should look like that if we graphed out and mapped out all of our sets and reps and volume and intensity. If intensity looks really high and volume is really low, we're doing something wrong in our planning. Okay, block 2, I want to get stronger. Can I get stronger with a lot of volume? Not when it happens with a lot of intensity. When we're trying to maximize intensity, volume has to go down, but we can't take out too much because we still need to maintain that hypertrophy and maintain that development for our in-season phase. So block 3, power, volume is going to go down even more because we can't move that fast for that long. Intensity is going to stay somewhat moderate. We're trying to move fast, but we're trying to almost allow ourselves to recover and perform well for our season. And then maybe we're going into speed. Volume is going to be low, intensity is going to be lower, but we're trying to maximize velocity and maximize speed for that competition. Maybe I stimulate some strength in there. Maybe I stimulate some power. Maybe I maintain a little bit of hypertrophy, but it's never going to be the main goal because speed is what I want here and I want to achieve maximal speed at the end of that mesocycle, at the end of that block, at the end of the macrocycle. Because that's what I've dictated as what I want most. If hypertrophy was what I wanted most, it would be all the way flipped around and I probably wouldn't even touch power or speed. If strength was my goal, I would maybe touch power, I probably wouldn't touch speed very much. Okay, but strength would be here, power would intermix with strength, and hypertrophy would be more of a goal. I would maybe spend more time there. That's why we think from our end and move back to the start, so then we know what will allow us to achieve the most velocity. We build capacity, force capacity, metabolic capacity, force and introduce high velocity, allow high velocity to be realized. There's a general structure. It's not going to be exactly perfect through all of our sessions, but this is our goal for these mesocycles. So now if we backtrack a little bit, it's a lot of information, but if we go to our systematic approach to the entire structure, our goal is progression. So we need to pick our periodization style, our approach first. So I know I'm going to use a 3 up, 1 down major structure for my microcycle, my mesocycle, for my end-all macrocycle. Okay? I plan my training frequency for my calendar, choose my exercises based on what I have available. If I only have a barbell and dumbbells, I can't pick things that don't include those tools. If I don't have dumbbells, I can't pick exercises with dumbbells. If I don't have kettlebells, I can't pick kettlebell exercises. So pick your exercise choice menu based on logistically what you have available. Okay? And then what will allow you to train in the way that you need to achieve your goal. Pick your exercise order, intensity, volume, and rest for each session at the end. Okay? This is what we do within the session in the microcycle. None of that can happen until we've planned our approach and planned our training frequency. Then we can start implementing the actual training sessions. Sessions should be the last thing we develop. And we need to develop them as we go throughout the macrocycle. If you develop them all first, things change. People get hurt, goals change, coaches' ideas change. You need to be fluid and able to change these because you have that structure at the start. They have that structure. So some key terms that we need to remember for this section. Supercompensation is our ability to achieve and be above our previous ability. This is what we want to happen at the end. Okay, this is where we back off from our volume, back off from our intensity, and we realize that adaptation that we were trying to gain. Okay, this is our realization, supercompensation. We were overreaching and then we surpassed that. We fully recovered, fatigue is gone. This is our supercompensation. Tapering is our ability to allow that supercompensation. Key for tapering, especially for speed and power sports, strength sports, 3 weeks is a good taper and volume should be cut to 50% by the last week. Volume should be cut to 50% by the last week. If we've cut our volume on average down to 50% through that 3 weeks, we will maximize supercompensation in week 3. So maybe it starts out week 1, we're at 70%, week 2, 50%, week 3, volume's at 25%. That will allow maximum supercompensation. If we cut it down to 50%, 50%, 50%, we'll also maximize supercompensation. Does this work well for sports where we need to be good all the time? No. So don't plan to taper for team sports unless you're at postseason. So it should be a maintenance and then maybe a slight taper at the end. Tapering more often happens in meet-based sports, something like track, swimming, weightlifting, powerlifting, where you are competing on a day or on a week, or a few weeks. This ending point of the taper where we want the supercompensation is called our peak. Peaking. Peak is the highest you can go, so you can't peak more than about 2 times per year. Optimally, you peak once a year, or once a year, and then maximally peak every 4 years. You cannot peak every month. It's not a peak. It's more like a point, or a step. Peaking is your number 1 point. You'd want to peak at the point where you want to be the best. So maybe it's world championships, maybe it's Olympic championships, maybe it's NCAA national conference if you know that you're not going to make it past that, or regionals or nationals depending on your level. This peak is the end of your macrocycle. If you're working with a meet-based sport. Peak, end of macrocycle. Okay. And then we need to look at overtraining. If we do things wrong, or the athletes do things wrong, we can cause overtraining. What we need to watch out for is signs of overtraining, because we are going to overreach athletes or get them to the point of almost overtraining and then recover. Overtraining comes from a lack of recovery. So if we're not planning in those deload mesocycles, deload microcycles, and we're not allowing recovery, that's when we see overtraining. It is difficult to overtrain, but it happens. Okay? It's indicated by fatigue. So your athletes are tired. If your athletes start getting sick, it's a key that you're probably overreaching, okay? And you probably need to back off soon. A lack of recovery, and it leads to poor performance. Overtraining and overreaching are different. Overreaching is planned. Overtraining is the outcome of not planning your recovery properly. Recovery is the key. Okay? We can't adapt unless we recover, so we need to plan recovery as the biggest piece of all. Okay? Plan that recovery. Okay? This all comes back to our general adaptation syndrome. If we look at our plan, we are trying to deplete, allow restoration and supercompensation throughout the year. So this happens from initial stimulus. This is what we're really trying to do over the whole year. We're trying to allow supercompensation at the end. Or we're trying to do this through each microcycle, mesocycle, and build it through for the whole macrocycle. If we don't allow this restoration or recovery, we don't supercompensate, and we begin to exhaust and fatigue and go down. Okay. So that taper, okay, plan supercompensation, plan variation to allow for supercompensation. Think of it for meet or individual competition-based sports, not team sports. Okay, so if you're planning to use swimming or track or MMA or some strength sport for your plan, you should have a peak time and a taper period in your macrocycle for your project. Okay? If you have a team field court sport, you should have a maintenance with a slight taper for your macrocycle. Okay? You should not have a taper at the start of season. You can't have a 12-week taper. Okay? It's not going to happen. No matter how good your athletes feel when they taper them at the end, plan that taper. Okay? So keys to effective taper, timing volume for about 50% by meet time over 3 weeks. Maintain training frequency. Athletes like training frequency, that plan, that structure. And if you start to cut out and pull training sessions, they start to get lazy. Okay, you'll probably see that they'll get lazy or they aren't planning their recovery well. What do they do when you give them free time? Anything but good things. Okay? Idle hands are the devil's play toy. Okay? So give them a training frequency, even if it's just 30 minutes of training. Get them in the same structure, and maintain that frequency. Okay? Even if it's just getting in there and doing foam rolling and then they leave, it's still allowing the same frequency, the same structure. Okay? Intensity is what we should decrease about 2 weeks to 10 days from competition. So volume, about 50% drop. Keep intensity as long as we can till about 10 days out, 14 days out. Okay? If you're planning on week cycles, 2 weeks out is a good plan to go for. Okay, so this is where we start to drop intensity, lower it down, meet the volume, and then we should be able to compete at our best. Okay, just more of our focus now is on building recovery, building proper technique for that sport. Okay, so we're ready to go. Fatigue is gone and we have super compensated for that competition so we can compete to our maximum. Okay, to our maximum. All right. That's going to be it for periodization. I'll go through a review lecture and post up a review lecture also. Are there any questions?
I don't know if I missed it. Are we still meeting Thursday?
No meeting Thursday. All right, cool. Thank you guys for showing up for our last day of the semester.